Ms. Riggs, what is it that you have for us?
Your Honor, we conferred with defendants and legislative defendants, and assuming that we can finish our rebuttal case within the restricted time that the court has available for us on Thursday, which we think we can, we'd like to propose having scheduled closings Friday morning. Right now, plaintiffs plan to call Professor Quinn and Senator McKissick in rebuttal. We have committed to letting the other parties know promptly about Professor Hirsch as soon as Kim Strack testifies, after she testifies. And that would, so scheduling for Friday would let us better prepare for helpful closing presentations on Friday. And I think we can finish by the normal 1 p.m. time on Friday. And I think this represents the agreement of the parties.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes, Your Honor, we have no objection to proceeding in that fashion.
Mr. Cox?
We are fine with that as well.
Okay, let me, I'll tell you what I'll do is sometime between now and the afternoon break, let me, just so I'm clear, what does your Thursday look like? Ms. Riggs, when you said this schedule on Thursday, what were you envisioning that to look like?
We anticipate finishing our rebuttal case probably early on Thursday, or hopefully, certainly no later than when the court needs to leave for other obligations, which I understood to be around 1 or 1:30.
Okay, so what you're proposing then is we start at 9:30 Thursday morning, and you think you can finish, say, around the lunch time period?
I believe so, Your Honor.
And then we would take the rest of Thursday without any court at all and allow you to prepare your closings and that sort of thing.
That would be our proposal if it's acceptable to the court.
Okay, I'll tell you what, let me check with the other judges and I'll get back with you on that, okay?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Anything else before we resume?
Nothing for the legislative defendants, Your Honor.
Ms. Visotskaya, are you prepared to proceed? Are you here?
Yes, Your Honor, I'm here. And when Mr. Giller finishes with his cross-examination, I'm ready.
Okay, great. Mr. Giller, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And Ms. Moss, are you here?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Mr. Neesby, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, Your Honor.
All right, then I believe that we were in the middle of Mr. Giller's cross-examination. Mr. Giller, you may ask your next question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Neesby, I just want to clarify the record a little bit and make sure our last few questions were sort of clear. I think the best way to do that, can we just bring up plaintiffs 125 and 126 next to each other? The first page of both. So, and this is just for sort of clarity, I think it'll make it a little bit easier. So, Mr. Neesby, on Monday, September 16, 2019, this is PX 125, you provided to the legislative defendants and to plaintiffs the DHH death files, the DMV address change files, the master death index from SSAs, and the national change of address files. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And as we discussed, that also included the underlying data for the no match list that was run based on the voter registration DMV data, the current data dictionary, the latest data dictionary, and DMV tables. Is that correct?
That sounds right.
I mean, that's just what the document says, right? On the second
Yeah,
page.
it hadn't scrolled down yet, but yes.
Oh, no worries. I just want to try to make sure the record's clear. And for PX 126, and these were the files, the documents on PX 125 that were utilized by the state to create its 2019 no match list. Is that correct?
Not what's being represented, highlighted there. It's actually the lower paragraph where it just says the latest data, the DMV tables that were provided to us on 8/24/2019, and it would have also likely included the voter reg file that was also part of that same date. So
Right.
So the second part, yes.
So I could just repeat that to make sure it's clear. So you said the voter reg file, but which of these were the data that you would have relied on for the 2019 no match list?
The second highlight there contains where it says underlying data for the no match list that was run based on voter reg and DMV data. That bullet plus the 3 other bullets after that. So that includes the voter registration table that was generated as of that date, 8/24/2019, and the DMV tables that were part of that production.
Great, thank you. And turning to PX 126, just want to sort of, again, if you look at the top one, this is dated Wednesday, November 11th, 2020. And it's from your counsel to the 2 plaintiffs. And it says the state board produced the voter file, the D8's death file, and the national change of address file. Is that correct?
That's what it says, yes.
And the board did not produce the DMV address change file because it no longer receives that information from the DMV and hadn't received it since the last production. Do you see that?
Yes,
That's correct.
that is correct.
And it also says the board no longer receives the master death index. Is that right?
That's correct. And just in case there's any confusion, these aren't files related to the no match list at all.
Understood. But this represents what you did and did not produce to the plaintiffs.
That's correct.
We can take these down. Mr. Neesby, I just want to ask a couple more questions. You have the ability to determine the race of voters when you analyze the data that goes into the state board no match list. Is that correct?
I have the ability, yes.
And the no match list you created in 2019 after the passage of SB 824, that didn't include any race data in its analysis. Is that right?
No, it did not.
So you are currently unaware of the breakdown by race of North Carolinians who appear on the 2019 no match list.
That's correct.
And some previous no match lists have included race data. Is that correct?
That's correct.
To your knowledge, there was no matching analysis done between 2014 and 2019. Is that right?
None done by the State Board of Elections that I'm aware of. As matching to DMV, yes.
What do you mean you say as match to DMV?
We do matching analysis all the time, but we haven't done anything to analyze no match rates of DMV issued IDs.
So just to clarify, I think we're saying the same thing, but so you haven't done effectively a no match list as you described it between 2014 and 2019.
That's correct.
And just to confirm, no one from the legislature asked you to create a no match list in 2018.
2018, not that I'm aware of.
And no one from the North Carolina legislature prior to SB 824's passage in 2018 asked you about the effect of SB 824 or the effect that SB 824 might have on voters based on their race or ethnicity.
That has not been asked of me, no.
And it wasn't asked of you?
No.
And that includes any sponsors of SB 824?
That's correct.
And any staff, legislative staff?
They haven't asked me that, no.
And you're not aware of whether the legislature asked anyone else at the state board to conduct an analysis of SB 824's impact on voters based on their race or ethnicity?
I'm not aware of any request for that, no.
And you didn't do any such analysis prior to December 19, 2018?
No.
And you're aware that SB 824 contains a different set of qualifying ID than HB 589?
I am.
And no one's asked you to analyze, or no one from the legislature has asked you to analyze how those changes in the list of acceptable IDs would impact the number of North Carolinian voters who do not hold an ID that qualifies. Is that right?
That's right, not that I recall.
So you don't know based on the analysis that you've done, whether SB 824 disproportionately affects voters of color.
I don't know.
No further questions at this time.
Ms. Veselskaya, would you like to cross-examine the witness?
Yes, please, Your Honor. Mr. Nisby, I wanted to talk to you about the 2019 analysis that have been done under your supervision for the state board. Could you please explain how you went about creating that matching?
Certainly. We had a two-stage matching process. The first stage was to provide what we felt were strict field combinations that strictly matched to the DMV as much as possible to match to the DMV list. And then that brought a no match list of, I think, 348,000. And then we did a second analysis to determine of those that matched, which ones were unexpired, with the caveat that if it expired after they were 65, they were deemed for the purposes of this analysis to be unexpired. And then those that were expired, we brought into that no match list to add up to 617,000. So that's roughly speaking, although I could go in far more detail, how that no match list was created.
Were there policy considerations by the state board about how to go about creating this list?
Yes, we determined that it was in the best, that we thought that being over-inclusive in the no match list was the best policy, because we felt that it was best to notify someone that does have an ID about the fact that inadvertently notify someone that does have an ID that about the rules of that photo ID may be required, versus leaving someone off the list and not notifying them and they really did not have an ID. So that was the policy decision that we made as part of the executive team.
And is that related to the objective of this matching analysis, being that a mailer was being sent to the voters who you identified as not matching?
That's correct. So this was for the purposes of not determining absolutely who doesn't have a photo ID, but it was for the purposes of creating a mailing list to the voters. And therefore, we are trying to inform as many people as possible, even if we brought into that no match list people that actually did have an ID. Our feeling was the negative of that was that we'd have yet another person informed, which isn't much of a negative from a logistics perspective.
So at the time where this policy consideration was being discussed at the state board, where did you discuss also the ways by which you could have made a less strict analysis and therefore a less over-exclusive list?
Over-inclusive, I think is what you mean.
Over-inclusive, that's right.
Yeah, we could have added, number one, more field combinations. So we had 9 field combinations and they were deemed to be fairly strict, and we could have added far looser combinations. We could have tried to account for misspellings and typos through different algorithms that try to account for typos. We could have, we have a nickname database. We could have joined to a nickname database to bring in nicknames of Bobby might therefore join with a Robert. We also felt we could take in phonetic algorithms to account for similar sounding names, Brian with a Y, Brian with an I. And then we could have done better. We talked about doing better data cleansing to account for where you might have names in the wrong fields, or you might have certain punctuation that's allowed in one database and not allowed in another, such as a semicolon. We tried to, or not a semicolon, an apostrophe or an accent, and we tried our best to do that, but there was further steps we could have taken. And I think the last thing is that there were items that would be complicated to bring in as a unique identifier, like address, that we could have standardized and brought that. It's not a unique identifier, but with extra field combinations, it could have been. So all that we discussed, and we decided, because in the interest of time and in the interest of being over-inclusive, it would be best to do a strict matching analysis.
Because the end goal of that was to notify as many potential voters who were lacking ID about the photo ID requirement. Is that right?
That's correct.
And to your knowledge, has that mailer actually been produced on the basis of the list that you and your team has created?
I believe it has, yes.
In fact, you have created an affidavit for the federal litigation concerning this photo ID law. Is that correct?
Yes,
And that mailer was attached as an Exhibit A to your affidavit. Is that right?
it was.
And let me see if my technology works with me today, but I will show you, I will try
And
to show you that exhibit.
I forgot one other, if you don't mind, one other discussion I had was about making it less over-inclusive, was about bringing in historical information as well, and from both the DMV and from voter registration data sets.
Let me see if I could share my screen. Okay, Mr. Nisby, can you see the document that I'm showing to you, which is at the bottom, should be labeled as JX880?
Yes, I can.
Okay, is that the affidavit that you prepared about the process that the board employed in creating the distribution list we have just discussed?
Yes,
And let me scroll to the end of that affidavit. And Exhibit A that I just mentioned, is that the mailer that has been sent to the North Carolinians who appeared on your no matching list, to your knowledge?
to my knowledge, yes.
And the mailer, looking at the top portion of the exhibit, the mailer states that State Board of Elections has identified you as a voter who may not have an unexpired NC driver's license or non-operator ID issued by the Division of Motor Vehicles. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then towards the bottom half of that page, there is a question box that says, can I vote if I do not have an ID? Do you see that?
I do.
And let me see. Actually, let me ask you to look still at the top of that mailer. At the very first information box where it says, why did I receive this mailing? Do you see that?
I do.
It does say there in a bullet 3 that receiving this mailing does not mean that you are ineligible to vote or do not have a form of acceptable identification. Is that correct?
That's what it says, yes.
And that goes back to what you were explaining before about the objective of creating this distribution list, not being a definitive list of voters who lack DMV, qualifying DMV issued IDs. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So in addition to these limitations of the voter matching exercises that you talked to me about, did the distribution list that you created for the state board include any other forms of the ID except, in addition to the ones that DMV has shared with the state board?
It only included DMV issued IDs, no other forms of acceptable IDs.
And so would it be accurate to say then that added yet another over-inclusive feature to the list that you created?
If your purpose was to determine who would be eligible if an election were to happen, then it would make that over-inclusive, the fact that we didn't include that.
Let me ask you, you have been asked some questions at the beginning of your testimony today by Ms. Moss about your matching analysis that you do for provisional voter files. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And are you familiar with that process? And do you do, in fact, that matching?
Yeah, I created the process and I do that matching, or I have someone under me do that matching, yes.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about whether or not you can vouch or you could say that every single field that appears in a provisional data file is an accurate field to the State Board of Elections knowledge?
Provisional data file, do you mean the DMV data we based the provisional audit off of, or the provisional file from the state board?
Let's
The-
talk about both of those. DMV data first.
So we get several data sets from the DMV, and I can go into those if you want to. They are, they're like MVD voters, an example, which it's the purpose of that analysis is to determine who has a voter registration transaction with the DMV. So there's tables in that analysis that wouldn't be used in a no match list. So we have a MVD voter table that provides in-person voter registration transactions that are used as part of that provisional audit. We also have the internet transaction table as well as internet address table, and I'm using colloquial terms. It's, it's a very precise name, that provide internet registration, voter registration transactions from the DMV. And so we're trying to then determine if for some reason that voter registration transaction didn't get down to the county, and that's why the voter is voting a provisional ballot. And so that's the purpose of that analysis.
And I think I'm trying to ask you a question about something different. I am wondering about the provisional file that is created to identify all provisional voters and how the votes were disposed of. So the state board, I guess the second part that we
Okay.
get to. So the one question that I wanted you to clarify is there is a field in that file that is called citizenship data. And I wanted to ask you whether or not that field is, whether the board knows whether that field is populated with accurate data.
That field, is, to the best of my knowledge, is whether that was checked on the provisional application, either usually by the election official, whether it, and they were therefore would have been told arguably from the voter. So whether that reflects reality, there's possibility that someone forgot to check it. There's also the possibility that it was inaccurate in some fashion. Where we've had to investigate that field before, what we've done is we've sent that to our investigation team, and then they cross-reference that with SAVE, a database that has citizenship information as one part in an investigation where that's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't say it's accurate without investigation.
But you certainly didn't do that for provisional files that were produced in here in this litigation.
We did not do any analysis of the accuracy of citizenship data for this one.
Thank you. You were asked questions earlier by Ms. Moss and by Mr. Giller about the data that was produced in fall of 2020 to all parties, to legislative defendants and also to plaintiffs. Is that correct? Do you recall that conversation? And then Ms. Moss, during her direct examination of you, showed you information about the voter registration biennial list maintenance that was done in 2021 after the files that were being asked about were produced. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You recall those two parts of conversations?
I do.
So the file, the information that was produced by the state board, by your team, to plaintiffs and to the legislative defendants in the fall of 2020 would have included, it did include, in fact, the voters who were later removed in 2021 from the voter register file due to biennial maintenance.
Yes, the biennial list maintenance, they would have been in there if they were removed for that purpose.
And that was the data that was produced to the parties, correct?
That's correct.
And is that related to the inflation that you have been discussing with Ms. Moss about, the voter registration inflation?
So those records would arguably be inflated if indeed those voters were ineligible to vote. So of course, our list maintenance activities are somewhat proxies for that question if they're ineligible because we haven't contacted them in several years. But to me, when I say list inflation, I'm talking about ground truth reality. So it is a proxy for that.
So those voters were in the data sets that were given to plaintiffs and legislative defendants. And then later, some of them were removed during the biennial maintenance procedures.
That's correct.
That's all the questions I have.
All right, Ms. Moss, do you have other redirect questions?
I do have some, Your Honor. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Neesby.
Good afternoon.
During your cross-examination by Mr. Giller, and please correct me if I have this wrong, but I believe that you, in response to several of his questions related to the DMV files that were produced and the State Board of Elections files that were produced, you several times referenced that the important part is that they be on the same day. Do you recall that testimony?
I do.
Okay, can you explain for us what you meant by that?
Sure. What I mean by that is you need to take the data is always as updated as it is, meaning list maintenance is a routine process that's always happening. So whatever you pull that data, that is as updated as it can be. But the point that you have to do with the match is make sure that the data from the two databases in any matching analysis is pulled on the exact same date, preferably at the same time. If you don't do that, you can adjust sometimes for timing differences, but you have to be very careful when doing that.
Okay. Is there enough information in the voter registration files that were produced in this case to be able to, for lack of a better word, sort by the date an individual was registered?
Yes, the voter registration file has a registration date. So if you're looking precisely for when they were registered, now there are some inaccuracies in that field, but there's enough data for it.
Objection, move to strike. That is arguably expert testimony regarding exactly what, not any analysis he did, but an opinion that Ms. Moss asked him for. My previous objection was on mute.
The objection is overruled. You can answer the question.
Do you want to repeat the question? I think I answered it, but maybe I didn't.
I believe you answered it, but the question was whether there was enough data in the files produced to be able to, and this is my word, sort by the date a voter was registered.
Yes, there's the registration date field. And there's actually an original registration date field as well that goes back to the time they arguably originally registered in any county.
Focusing for a moment on the 2015 affidavit that has been touched on briefly during your testimony today, did that affidavit describe in detail the fields from the DMV database that you would look at if you were attempting to address, if you were attempting to do a no match analysis?
2015 affidavit, you said? What was the date you said?
I believe it was in 2015. It was the affidavit that you submitted in the Curry litigation.
Oh, and the question was,
Did that affidavit contain a description by you of fields in the DMV data that you would look to if you were going to perform a no match analysis?
Objection. This is an expert testimony. The affidavit was a critique of Dr. Stewart, and it laid out what he would have done instead. And I believe that is the question that Ms. Moss is asking.
Your Honor, if I may, my question is simply a factual one, if whether that affidavit contained a description of fields. I've not asked him his opinions on just simply whether it contained a description of those fields. And I think my next follow-up will make clear why that's relevant.
The objection's overruled.
It contained a description of some of the fields that I would use for matching analysis.
And to your knowledge, did plaintiffs ever ask for those specific fields to be produced to them by the State Board of Elections in this litigation?
I don't, to my knowledge, I just know what was asked as part of the production. So they asked for the voter file, which is a vague term for all SBE tables. And so they didn't ask for specific fields. And we produced a lot of that. And then as far as the DMV data, I don't know what was asked for that one. We produced some of those fields because of the no match list in 2019, but I'm not aware of being asked for DMV data of the fields mentioned in that affidavit.
And then in terms of a response to your counsel's question about some of the policy considerations that went into creating the 2019 no match list, one of the points that you brought up of something that you considered, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, I understood this to be things that you considered but did not do, was bringing in historical data. Did I understand that correctly?
That's correct, from both the DMV side as well as from the SBE side.
And what was your consideration with respect to bringing in historical data? What were you weighing?
One was, whenever you bring in historical data, your purpose is to find a match that was not otherwise found. And so almost definitionally, you're then making the no match list less over-inclusive. We felt that it wasn't worth the time and effort to bring in those historical data sets because our purposes was to create a mailing for anyone that might not have a photo ID. And so our purposes was to be over-inclusive. And so then it wasn't worth the effort of bringing in those historical data sets and doing that analytics.
And in terms of, you were also asked on cross by Mr. Giller about any analyses that you were asked to undertake. And I believe one of them was a question of whether you were asked to analyze how many voters on the voter registration roll actually have acceptable forms of ID. Do you recall that?
I do.
Okay. If you were asked to do such an analysis, which types of photo ID data would you have access to?
Objection. This is a hypothetical. He hasn't done this analysis, nor I believe has he been asked to by any of the parties.
Give me just 1 second. Can you repeat that question, Ms. Moss?
Sure. The question, and I can rephrase it if the concern is it's a hypothetical. My question is really, what sorts of ID data does the State Board of Election have access to?
Do you object to that question, Mr. Giller?
That phrasing is okay. No objection.
Okay. You may answer the question.
The only one I know for a fact that I currently have access to is county free issued IDs, free county IDs. The other data sets, and I'm trying to think through them, other than the DMV issued IDs, I don't believe I have access to personally. It's not to say we don't have it. I don't believe we do, though.
Okay. Do you have access, or you being the State Board of Elections, do you have access to passport data?
We don't have access. It isn't that we couldn't request that data. We don't have current access to that data.
Okay. And have you ever had to request that data previously?
I have never requested that data. I don't know if in the Viva litigation someone did. Either way, we never received that data, to the best of my knowledge.
So whether as part of the Viva litigation or otherwise, to your knowledge, has the state board ever been provided passport data?
The only thing that's closest to that is we provide an output of Dr. Stewart's analysis, which did indicate whether his match analysis linked to passport data, but we didn't receive the raw passport information directly from the federal government.
Okay. Similarly, do you regularly receive data on veterans IDs and who possesses veterans IDs in the state of North Carolina?
I do not. No,
Does
we
the
do not.
state, excuse me, does the State Board of Elections regularly receive data on registered voters in North Carolina who possess military IDs?
No, we do not.
And would that would that answer include both active duty military and what the government calls their dependents?
I don't believe we receive either of those things, no.
Do you regularly receive data from any other state agency on state-issued IDs? Apart from DMV IDs, but state employee IDs, let me be more precise.
I don't, as far as I can tell, State Board of Elections does not receive data on state employee IDs, no.
Okay, and does the State Board of Elections regularly receive data on university IDs for universities within North Carolina?
No, we don't.
One final question for you, Mr. Neesby, at this time. In your experience in working with the DMV data, what are different types of licenses that an individual can have as reflected in that data?
Different types of licenses. They can have a non-operator ID. They can have that would not provide driving privileges, but would be useful for voting. They could, under this law, they could have a Class C driver's license. I believe there's also learner permits, and then motorcycle licenses as well. And there may be more.
And to your knowledge, can an individual possess one or more of those types of IDs? For example, could an individual have a commercial driver's license and a regular driver's license?
To my knowledge, individual in the database would have up to 3 driver license fields in either the driver ID or driver history table.
If I could just have one moment.
And I should say current. There's also history that applies to that as well.
Mr. Neesby, I very much appreciate your taking the time to answer our questions here today. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Giller, do you have any recross?
No recross. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Visatskaya, do you have any recross?
No, Your Honor.
Did I get your name right that time?
Yes, thank you.
I've been working hard on it.
I appreciate it.
All right, so I believe we may have a couple of questions from the court. And so I believe I'll call on Judge Rozier.
Thank you. Mr. Neesby, good afternoon. I'm Judge Vince Rozier. Just a few hopefully simple questions for you. You've given some testimony regarding the analysis or the process of completing a match or no match list. I'm just curious, how long does that process normally take in your experience? The times that you engage in that process, how long does it take?
Your Honor, it depends on how precise you want to get. And by that, I mean how accurate. So, and I define accuracy by minimizing both false positives and false negatives, i.e. reducing over and under inclusivity. So a simple analysis can be done in a day or two, but you're going to likely need more time for data cleansing and other things to do a more complex analysis. I have told folks that have ever asked on the executive team if I would be willing to do it, I would say it'd take 2 months for me to do it. If you want it to be the most accurate that I can make it.
And does that include the time for the request that you would initially make, including, well, if you're making a request to DMV, what is the timeline for that? Do you automatically just send an email, you get it that same day? What's the process for the timeline for that?
It depends on, so it can be done very quickly if the right people are doing it. So I've requested DMV data and received it within a few days before. And then I've requested it and it's taken several weeks. So depending on who's involved in the communication is really the answer to that.
And is that timeline or that lag a part of the 2 months that you describe, or is that in addition to the 2 months?
And I want to be clear that, Your Honor, that the 2 months is just my estimate.
Okay.
It would be once I have all the data sets I need, I would suggest I'd want 2 months to analyze it, but that's just my personal opinion, how long it would take to do the sort of analysis that I'd want to do.
So just so that I have the more precise understanding, like you said, it may take longer to have the more precise data set. Is the 2 months just so you can underpromise and overperform, or is that an accurate estimation of the timeline?
If I had determined the exact algorithms I was knowing I was going to run, and determined the permutations of the field combinations I needed, and had that all lined up, you could do it far sooner. Meaning, if you had done this exact matching analysis before, you could automate it fairly quick. Within, it would just be the processing time. When I'm doing something that we haven't done before, I like the extra time because you want to examine the output of that analysis. And sometimes every single time you do a different field combination, you're examining that output, and it takes a tremendous amount of time to make sure you're not accidentally have done something to increase or decrease over inclusivity. So it's really the running the analysis and determining the decision points of the data analyst that I'd want to do that would take that time.
Well, let me narrow that down a little more. In notifying people of the fact that they may be on a no match list, what would be the timeline, or what was the timeline for that?
The analytical work I did in a weekend. So and there might have been some time beforehand, but it was several days. And unfortunately we had to do it on a weekend, but so I would say it was a handful of days.
Okay. I think those are the questions that I have. I think Judge Oflu may have some, and I'll see if I have any after him.
Thanks, Your
Okay.
Honor.
All right, Judge Oflu, you have questions?
And good afternoon, Mr. Neesby. I was just asking you if you could hear me okay, and then I realized I was muted. So I answered my own question. You couldn't hear me okay. But can you hear me all right now?
I can, yes.
All right, sir. So again, just some simple questions, I hope. You were describing in your testimony for the lawyers that there are active voters, and then there are inactive voters, and then the third category, and you would call them what, removed?
Removed, there's more categories than that, but removed is what we mentioned in the testimony.
Okay. Now you've got me curious. Are there ones below removed?
I don't know if I'd say below. There's denied, which means you never were a registered voter. There's a status called temporary. Now it's called UOCAVA, but it has to do with military voters. And then that rounds it out. That's all of them.
Okay. Well, let me just give you a hypothetical just so I can understand what the status of a voter would be. Suppose like 10 years ago, a registered voter was very interested in voting in that election and voted in 2010, for example. And then up until now, that voter just wasn't very excited about voting. he or she had gotten the mailers and had been gone to inactive, and then I presume had gotten to the remove stage by 2020, correct?
That would be correct, yes.
Okay. So suppose that voter goes into vote in the presidential election in 2020. What happens?
They wouldn't be on the rolls in the poll book. They would actually, because they'd have a removed status, they would therefore not be offered a regular ballot. They would be, however, offered a provisional ballot. And if they voted that provisional ballot and then testified as part of their signing of that provisional ballot that they didn't move outside the county, that provisional ballot would count. If, however, they did move outside the county, then that provisional ballot would not count.
Okay. So in other words, they don't have to re-register, but they do have to fill out a provisional ballot attesting to the accuracy of their address has been the same, whatever. Their county has been the same.
Their county has been the same. And that provisional ballot is a re-registration. It does double duty. So they actually become registered again.
Okay. So when to make it relevant to this case, in the fall of 2020, when the information was given to the parties to do whatever they wanted to do with a no match analysis, did those files contain the active, inactive, and removed?
And all the other, and denied and temporary UCAVA. Yes, it contained all of those.
Okay. Now, you were asked about the mailer that was sent out, I believe by one of the council, to say that you may not qualify. When was that mailer sent out?
I don't know the precise date. My memory says that it was either late 2019, early 2020, but I'm not precisely sure.
Okay. Now,
Obviously, it was.
sorry. No, you go ahead.
My apologies, Your Honor. Obviously, it was after the no match analysis, which was done in late 2019.
You were also asked questions about the historical data files, and thank you for. I think when you were asked on direct, you said there was CDL and you couldn't remember the third, but I think you have remembered the third, and the third is motorcycles, correct?
That might be it. Yes, I
Right.
can't. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
And those aren't if you mind one clarification, those are license types, not historical data. I don't know if that was the question, but.
Okay. Well, maybe I've got the wrong. What is the file called that contains the three separate or the different kinds of licenses?
So there is probably a code in the code table, MVD codes table, that differentiates them, but they are simply different licensees that could show up in either the MVD driver ID table, which is the most current quote unquote issuance, or the MVID driver history table. But these different license types are not in separate tables, they're in one table.
Okay.
Or those two tables, yes.
Okay. So where I'm going with this is that when the DMV keeps those records of those different licenses that are issued to one person, they must have different numbers on the licenses. There must be three different numbers on the licenses, correct? Of the license number.
There are unique records in those driver ID tables. And therefore that's the uniqueness there, or the driver ID history table. There's also, I believe, a motorcycle table that I've never analyzed, and I couldn't speak to it, just to be sure, just in the trying to be inclusive of everything.
Right.
I don't think there's, surprisingly, not a unique ID that I can recall that's specific to that driver's license. There's only the customer ID, but you can determine it based on a different record.
Okay. But presumably because the DMV keeps complete social security numbers, the complete social security number would show up on all three of those different licenses, correct?
It could be joint, so it'd be on a different table, but yes, in general, yes, it's on the citizen table. MVD citizen table is the complete social security number. So it's a different table that you would have to join in by joining by customer ID.
Right.
But you could pull that in. And that table has nothing to do with citizenship, by the way. It's just.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine. But focusing in on the social security number, the point is that the same social security number would show up in no matter what the tables you call them or what they are. So when you did the no match analysis, you were not trying to eliminate duplicate social security numbers from those files because you wanted to be over inclusive.
I think this will answer your question. My first matching was to the citizen table directly, which means that I'm matching to the individual, not to the multiple driver's license they might have. And so, therefore, that included them in the 348,000, if my memory serves me on the number. The second processing part is to join it to the driver ID tables, which then delineate every single issuance that person has. And then I would try to determine if at least one of those issuances was unexpired, with the caveat that we talked about previously.
Okay. But my point is that you all didn't do that because you didn't want to, you wanted to be over inclusive in the notices that were going to be sent out.
We didn't do which, remove. I apologize, Your Honor. I'm not sure I'm following.
Well, really what it is since it's all the same person, you don't want to say that there are 3 people on the no match list. You want to say it's all the same person. But for your purpose, you're just trying to send out letters. But for somebody trying to figure out a no match analysis, they've got the ability to see that they have the same social security number.
On the DMV side, but I match to a unique, generally speaking, match to a unique social security number because it's a unique driver's license. There are a few people, very rare, that have two driver's licenses have the same social security number in the database, DMV database, but it's very rare.
Right.
So I don't think we had that problem per se. The goal of removing all duplicates possible, we definitely didn't do. We did do analysis of removing as much duplication as we could have as part of our no match list. But as far as all of that duplication, whether or not it's social security number or not, you're correct. We didn't do all of that could have been done.
Right. And don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing. I'm just trying to figure out the process that you were doing. You were trying to be over inclusive, but you're also at the same time trying to eliminate false positives and false negatives to the extent possible.
That's correct.
Okay. So now, were the files that contained to your knowledge, the files that were sent to the experts or to the parties to do whatever analysis they wanted to do in the fall of 2020, did they include the ability to eliminate that duplication that we just talked about?
The voter file, I'm not exactly positive that if DMV sent any data to the plaintiffs or to the defendants separately, but the voter file contains information to partially limit duplication. Duplication itself is another matching analysis, and so the problems with matching kind of will infect any desire to remove duplication completely, or the limitations, I should say, of matching analyses. And the same would go on the DMV side. I don't know to what extent they got DMV data other than the DMV data we provided for the no match list. There was more fields they could have used if that's all they received.
Okay. I appreciate it, Mr. Neesby. Thank you very much, sir.
All right, are there other questions from council based upon those asked by the court? Ms. Moss, Mr. Giller, Ms. Visatskaya, any other questions of the witness?
I have one follow-up question, Your Honor.
All right, you may proceed.
So, Mr. Neesby, based on what Judge Ofalu was asking you, did the DMV files that you used to conduct your matching analysis and that you provided to the experts in this case, did they include the historical data where other types of licenses would be stored?
I did not match on that. I believe we provided that history table. There's at least 3 history tables within the DMV. So you're talking about DMV driver ID history is what we call it. And I believe we included that table in our production, even though we didn't use it in the no match analysis. Oh no, we did use that one. My apologies. I'm confused for a second. We did use that table in the no match analysis, but just to be clear, that's not used in the original matching because you matched at a person level. That's used to determine if someone has an unexpired license, which was the second processing.
Okay, so understood about how you used it, but in terms of whether it existed in the data, your best recollection is that it did.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. That's all I have.
Mr. Giller, Ms. Visotskaya, any other questions?
Your Honor, I do have one clarifying question.
Okay.
Mr. Neesby, there was a question asked of you about when the mailers that we discussed went out, and your response, if I recall it correctly, was that it went out around the late part of 2019 or early 2020. Is that what you recall?
That is my best recollection. Yes.
And so just to refresh your memory, if I were to represent to you that the photo ID law has required the mailer to go at some point in September 2019, and that the federal injunction about this photo ID law has issued in December of 2019, does that you refresh and narrow your recollection about when the mailer would go out?
That's right. Yeah. So it went out roughly in September, I would guess. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I have one question.
All right, Mr. Giller, you may proceed.
Mr. Neesby, just to sort of confirm, the voter file by itself doesn't have social security numbers. Is that correct?
The voter file, like I said, is I particularly don't like that term because it's a set of tables, but it has partial social security number. It has last 4. And that specific field is in the voter reg table, voter_reg.
No further questions.
All right, any other questions by anyone? Last call.
Yes, Judge, can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Neesby, you used an acronym, I believe, with the military ID, UCAVA or something like
Sorry.
that. Can you tell me what that is? Because I'll never find it.
UOCAVA, UOCAVA. It's a federal law.
Okay, thank you. I'd be Googling that for a while. Thanks.
Any other questions from anyone? Mr. Neesby, thank you very much for your testimony today. You're now free to leave the courtroom.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, who will be the next witness for the legislative defendants?
Your Honor, the legislative defendants call Kim Strock as our next witness, and Ms. Moss will be handling the direct.
All right, and who will be handling this witness on behalf of the plaintiff?
Your Honor, I will, Allison Riggs.
Okay, and for the state defendants?
I will, Paul Cox.
Just as I was getting Ms. Visotskaya's name correct. Mr. Cox.
Call me that if you want to.
All right, can we let Ms. Strock in? Okay, Ms. Strock, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, let me see if I can hear you as well, but I don't see you right now. Can you talk some more?
I am, yes, I'm right. I'm here. I think my video is on.
Okay, there, I see you. Fair enough. Are you ready to give your testimony in this case?
Yes, Your Honor, I am.
If you would please raise your right hand.
Do you solemnly affirm that your testimony to the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and this is your solemn affirmation?
I do.
Thank you. You can lower your hand.
Ms. Moss, you may proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Strock. For the record, this is Nicole Moss with the Legislative Defendants. It's nice to see you. Can you please state your name for the record?
Kimberly Westbrook Strack.
And Ms. Strack, can you please tell the court a bit about your background, your education level, and your professional work history?
Yes, ma'am. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in criminal justice from East Carolina University. Out of college, I was a probation parole officer for a couple of years, utilizing that degree, and then was interested in continuing investigative work and was fortunate enough to be hired as an elections investigator with the State Board of Elections. That was in 2000, March of 2000, I believe. And in that role as an elections investigator, I was one of 2 election investigators, and those roles were pretty new at the State Board at that time. I think they might have been created maybe a year before I got there in 2000. And I was probably maybe the second, when I remember, I might have been the 3rd person in that particular role, the second not staying a week or 2. But the other election investigator and I were tasked with a couple of things with the new positions of identifying and investigating election irregularities, whether that be within the election or with voters. And then another real primary responsibility that we had as election investigators, as the former, my boss, Gary Bartlett, as executive director, instituted a sort of a proactive program with county boards of elections. At that time, the state did not have the ability basically to have all of the 100 counties centrally part of some system. And so it was more of a manual process of ensuring that county boards were adhering to their responsibilities and doing what they needed to do and were prepared for elections. And so as election investigators, we were tasked with what Mr. Bartlett called wellness checks. And so we would go around the state and we went to many of the 100 counties and conducted those wellness checks. Was sort of from top to bottom, looking exactly what the County Board of Elections was doing. Were they from everything from their precinct official training to how they were doing list maintenance, how they were organizing their office, how they were dealing with voter registrations, were they dealing with their campaign finance responsibilities. So that was a big role of what we did. About a little more than a year after that, I was promoted to deputy director for the agency for campaign finance. And I served in that role until 2013. And in my role as deputy director for campaign finance, I continued my investigative roles with campaign finance investigations. And because at that time, we were a pretty small agency, certainly much smaller than the agency is today. And so it was necessary that if we had projects that had to do with election administration, even though I was the deputy director of campaign finance, I would often be called to assist with those types of projects. And an example of that would be in 2004 was a presidential election. The state board was implementing HAVA in many ways, and there were several big things that happened in 2004 in North Carolina during that election. One being Carteret County lost over more than 4,000 votes on a machine. It's when we didn't have a paper trail for our voting equipment. And I was tasked with dealing with all of the sort of the issues with that election, that general election. So understanding that we had a recount, 2 recounts in that election. And so I was tasked with going around to the counties, obtaining information from the counties about what irregularities potentially had occurred there, and dealing with the first time that we really were dealing with provisional ballots and how we were rolling that out and how the counties were implementing it.
Now, you had mentioned, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you had mentioned the date of May of 2013 or 2013. What was the significance of that date?
2013 was when I was appointed as executive director.
So did you move from being a deputy director for campaign finance then into the executive director role?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Then, and so I'm sorry I interrupted you, but can you then please describe for the court what your responsibilities were once you became the executive director for the State Board of Elections?
Yes, that was in May of 2013. My responsibilities then was the overseeing the office of the State Board of Elections, also the administration of the elections in the 100 county boards of elections, ensuring the state board's orders were carried out, and also ensuring that campaign finance regulations and laws were being adhered to in the state and on the county level.
As executive director, did you have responsibilities for implementing any new election laws that the General Assembly might pass?
Shortly after I was appointed executive director in 2013, the General Assembly passed House Bill 589, which was a significant piece of legislation that had many components that I and the state board was tasked with implementing.
And while at the North Carolina State Board of Elections, were you a member of any associations or groups in your professional capacity?
Yes, when I became executive director, I was a member of NASID, which is the National Association of State Election Directors. There's one for secretaries of state, and there's a separate one for those states that have State Board of Elections directors.
And did you ever win any awards during your time at the state board?
In 2007, Common Cause North Carolina awarded me with the Democracy Award for my work in ethics and lobbying reform.
And during your time with the state board, did you undertake any specific types of initiative or actions that stood out to you as particularly important?
When I became executive director and House Bill 589 was implemented, and it was, I think it's fair to say, a very controversial aspects of that law were very controversial. There was a lot of I think, angst among a lot of people of how it would be administered. And what I come to sort of understood was that I needed to make sure that the actions that we took as a state board showed that we wanted to ensure that access to every single voter, we wanted to make sure every voter was equipped to have not only the access to voting, the opportunity to vote. And there was a separate side with House Bill 589 too, because there was definitely concerns about voter safeguards, I will call it, that people felt like needed to be in place. And so I wanted to make sure during my time that I was responsive to both of those concerns. Sometimes they seem like on different poles, and tried to make sure that the things that we did would address ensuring those things were carried out, such as with access, making sure that we based things on data, that when the county boards made decisions about early voting sites, they didn't do it based on anything. They had the data in front of them to see when it was that voters were actually voting. So they made informed decisions and not decisions that would be based on politics.
And during your time with the state board, did you have the opportunity to interact with voters in the state?
Yes, I mean, I feel like that I have had opportunities to interact with voters since my very first days with the state board as an election investigator. when we go to counties and do these wellness checks, part of that was a way to sort of be in the county, see what it is, how not only how the county board's operating, but how the people around, if they had questions, we were certainly there to sort of deal with that. I also, part of my projects would be later, even when I was a deputy director, is if there was a county that had, during an election, had concerns, the state board had concerns about how they were going to conduct that election, I was sent down to, I would say probably during my time, 8 or 9 counties to be there during the election. And my role was to assist the county board, but also to be there to help deal with any concerns voters or candidates or anyone dealing that election had. And I would say also, when you work for the state board, it doesn't necessarily matter what your role is at the state board. As the campaign finance deputy director, my division at that time was extremely small. I think there was 4 of us in all, including myself. And we would do, or I would do at that time, treasurer training and talking to different groups about compliance with campaign finance. And so a lot of these people were voters, and just because I was campaign finance, if they had questions about election administration, I would be able to answer some of those too, just because when people believe when you're with the state board, you know everything about what the state board does.
When you became the executive director of the state board, did you have oversight of any individuals whose jobs it was to interact with voters?
Yes. With House Bill 589, which it was just a couple of months after I was appointed executive director, we were provided funding so that we could have and hire a voter outreach team. The state board had not had that prior to that. We had individuals that had multiple roles that did what they could to help with the outreach efforts, but just because of funding issues, the state board had not had a dedicated team to outreach. And so part of House Bill 589 was I was allowed to have funding to be able to build such a team. And it was their primary job then to go out and interact with voters. And so that was a team that I managed.
Approximately how many elections did you administer during your years? I believe it's 6 years as executive director.
I believe there are usually two elections to 2 to 3 in an even year, and 3 in an odd. I think there was at least 16 elections that I was executive director.
And during your time with the state board, both as executive director and in your other roles, did you work with the directors of the county boards of elections?
Yes, I did. Early on with the wellness checks that we did, that was very much one-on-one with directors. I worked with directors during my time as the deputy director for campaign finance, because counties don't have as much involvement with campaign finance issues. So I spent a great deal of time dealing with county directors during that. And then absolutely as executive director, I had a lot of interaction with all 100 counties on definitely some a daily basis, and others, I mean, I had frequent contact with the county directors.
And apart from the county directors, did you have occasion to work with the members of the county boards of election?
Yes, there would be one of the main ways that we interacted with the county boards, because they're not staff, is we had statewide election conferences, and the county board members are required to be in attendance at those. And that is an opportunity for the state board staff to interact with the county boards, members themselves, to ensure that they have all the tools they need to carry out the responsibilities they have to carry out by law.
And during your time with the state board in your various capacities, did you have the opportunity to interact with poll workers or precinct volunteers during the various elections?
Yes, I did during the wellness checks that I did early on. That certainly was part of it because we would interact with poll workers and precinct officials. And during my time helping the counties in any of the counties that I actually was there for their election, there would be interaction with poll workers and precinct officials. And then with House Bill 589, when we were rolling out the photo ID implementation, there were certainly opportunities where we had webinars where there was interaction with either me or staff with actual poll workers in the counties.
After you left the state board, what did you do?
I left the state board the last day of May 2019. And in July 2019, I was contacted by the UNC system, the UNC Board of Governors, and they asked me to be the director of the Presidential Search Committee for a new UNC system president. And so I did that from July 2019 through, I think we hired the new UNC system president in June 2020.
And what is your current employment?
Currently, I am the managing partner of SRS Consulting Services, is a partnership I have with two other partners.
And what does SRS Consulting Services do?
We provide consultation services in financial and forensic accounting and forensics, fact-finding guidance, regulatory compliance, crisis communications. And one of the things we do, all three of us met doing, and our roles, my other two partners are former or retired FBI and IRS agent. And we met doing public corruption investigations while I was at the state board. And so we all have an expertise and familiarity with the election process. And so that's also one of the things that we have. This is a rather recent endeavor, but that's one of the things that we also have an expertise in.
Okay. And have you served as an expert in other voting cases?
Yes, I provided reports in 2020 in two cases. One that was the League of Women Voters versus the Virginia State Board of Elections. It was an absentee by mail case regarding absentee by mail. And I also submitted a report in DCCC versus, I forget the name, is an Oklahoma case.
Okay. Your Honors, under Rule 702, the legislative defendants would tender Ms. Kimberly Strock as an expert on the administration of elections in North Carolina, the implementation of election laws in North Carolina, on voter fraud in North Carolina, and on methods of detecting, investigating, and preventing voter fraud in North Carolina. And this will be on the basis of her knowledge, skill, experience, training, and education.
Your Honor, we do object to the tendering of the witness in those subjects. May I please conduct a brief voir dire line of questions targeted at addressing Ms. Strock's qualifications as an expert in election administration, election implementation, and voter fraud, especially since Ms. Strock's affidavit in this matter provides extensive purported expert opinions on these topics that rely on hearsay, which she would not otherwise be able to rely on as if she was testifying as a lay witness.
You can ask her some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Strock, we've met before, but for the record, my name is Allison Riggs, and I'm one of the attorneys for the plaintiffs in this case, and I have a few questions for you. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. You're offering opinions in this matter based on your education, professional training, and experience in the field of election administration, election implementation, fraud, and fraud investigations. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to talk to you about each one of those. You mentioned you have a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
But none of your coursework was specific to election administration, correct?
No, it was general, criminal investigations, certainly election investigations or criminal investigations.
None of your coursework was specific to election law implementation, correct?
No, not specific to election law. It was, like I said, it was criminal justice in investigating criminal violations.
Okay, and none of your coursework was specific to voter fraud.
Not specific to voter fraud. It was, as I said, it was general in investigating numerous types of crime. It didn't focus on any particular crime.
And it's fair to say that your college classes did not include any specific training in voter ID laws, correct?
No.
And just to be clear, you don't have any postgraduate academic or professional degrees, do you?
I do not.
The only other formal training you've received was from attending conferences where election directors discussed their work, correct?
As far as if you say formal training, yes, I did attend those. I also attended all of the conferences and trainings that were provided by the State Board of Elections, which is specific to North Carolina law. The information that I got at national conferences was very helpful, but it was not specific to North Carolina law. And I learned that from my years with the State Board of Elections.
There were no voter ID laws in North Carolina before 2013, correct?
That's correct.
And you only began attending those national conferences where you received that formal training, if you will, in 2013, correct?
That is correct.
And you can't recall how many, I believe the acronym is NSAD, NASED, the National Association of State Election Directors conferences. You could not recall how many of those you attended, correct?
I don't remember the specific number now.
The extent to which you remember discussing voter ID implementation at those national conferences was when you were occasionally divided into small groups, correct?
That's when I had one-on-one conversations. It was a topic during that time that was discussed broadly at the general sessions, but the time that as I think I spoke to you in my deposition about was when I had one-on-one with directors that were implementing photo ID in their states. It was usually in the small groups.
And in those small groups, voter ID was just one of many topics addressed. Isn't that right?
That is correct. Other election administration issues, yes.
Besides that, you do not have any other formal training that would qualify you as an expert, correct?
I don't know how to answer that as far as training. My experience is how I learned North Carolina election administration was through on the ground work.
You've never published any work that you believe establishes you as an expert in voter integrity or fraud concerns, correct?
I've never published, no.
And likewise have never published on election administration or implementation, correct?
No, I haven't.
You've never published any peer review work, isn't that right?
That is correct.
Turning to your experience, when you began working for the State Board of Elections, you spent a year as an election investigator from 2000 to 2001. Did I understand that?
Yes, you're correct.
But in that year, you don't recall working on a single case or allegation of in-person voter impersonation. Isn't that right?
I don't recall specifically a case of voter impersonation. There have been cases of voter impersonation that the state board has investigated, but during that year, I don't have a specific recollection of investigating a voter impersonation case.
And then when you were promoted to Deputy Director of Campaign Finance and served in that role between 2001 and 2013, isn't it true that you have no memory of investigating any matters related to in-person voter impersonation in that role?
Between 2001 and 2013?
That's correct.
No, I don't have any specific recollection of investigating personally those types of violations.
And none of the political corruption cases you or investigations you conducted as deputy director involved any in-person voter impersonation, correct?
No, I don't believe so.
In your report, the only example of voter fraud you addressed as a matter you worked on as executive director of the State Board of Elections was related to McCrae Dowless's absentee mail ballot scheme, correct?
That's correct in the report.
And to be clear, there were no issues of in-person voter impersonation fraud in that case, correct?
There were aspects of that case that from a previous year where there was some in-person voter fraud, not with showing up in person, but by absentee ballot. Yes, impersonating another voter.
So the answer to my question is there were no issues of in-person voter impersonation in that case, correct?
Correct. We had, well, let me clarify that. As I said, there was an earlier part of that case from 2016 where one of the reasons why we started investigating things in that county was because of an individual showing up and voting and was not allowed to vote because she was told she had already voted. So she was accused of being a double voter, but in fact, a person had voted in her name by absentee ballot, not in person.
Not in person. Okay. Is it when last we discussed, when last we talked at our deposition, is it still the case that SRS, your company that you started, has provided no services related to election integrity to date?
That's correct.
And it's still the case that SRS has provided no services related to election administration to date?
That's correct.
And in both of the cases in which you submitted expert reports, that involved challenges to the witness requirement for absentee mail-in ballots, not photo ID, correct?
That's correct.
And you didn't testify in any of those cases, you just submitted a report.
That's correct.
And you do not consider yourself an expert on implicit bias in election administration, correct?
No.
Now, without getting into its substance, you formed an opinion about how North Carolina voters view requiring photo identification, correct?
I generally made a comment about safeguards that North Carolina voters, with respect to the photo ID, I was referring to the majority vote on the constitutional amendment.
But your opinion as to what voters think or intend is based solely on your personal belief about these voters, and you didn't, for example, conduct any research studies or polls on this issue, correct?
Now, I don't think I can agree with that. I did not do any research or polls, but as I explained to you during my deposition, my belief is not just my personal opinion. It is based on almost 20 years of interacting with people, and especially during my time as executive director, of understanding what people are concerned about as far as elections and the safeguards that they ask about and are concerned about being part of North Carolina's laws. That's what that was based on.
Your Honor, as Ms. Strack's last answer confirms, she intends to rely heavily on hearsay and offering opinions on voter belief and voter behavior that isn't justified, and we do object to her tender as an expert in this case.
All right, it's now 3:30. We're going to go ahead and take our afternoon break at this point, and that'll give myself, the other judges, a chance to confer. And so, tell you what, instead of breaking from 3:30 to 3:45, let's break from 3:30 to 3:50. That may give us a little bit more time to talk and also to have a break. So we'll come back at 3:50. Okay, 3:50.
Thank you, Your Honor.